Welcome, it is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. Hopping on, the Bears on Monday announced they are hiring Ben Johnson, Detroit Lions offensive coordinator, as their new head coach. And hopping on to talk about the effect this obviously has on Chicago, but the NFC North as a whole. Obviously, this is a Packers-centric channel. And so how does this move affect Green Bay moving forward, and what aspects? And I guess to what degree? And first off, I don't want to say it. I don't want to. Hat tip to Chicago. And I genuinely mean that. They got their guy. The unequivocal, undoubted top name that was available. You ask just about anyone who's the top coach or the top name available for a head coaching vacancy, and I think almost everyone's saying Ben Johnson. And so the Bears got their guy. This is the rare case for Chicago in the last 10, 12 years where if it doesn't work out with Ben Johnson and the idea and hiring him and it falls flat on its face 3, 4, 5 years from now, I don't think people will look back and mock the Chicago Bears for the hiring of Ben Johnson, if that makes sense. Like, you remember when they hired Matt Eberflus, and a lot of people were scratching their heads, like, defensive coordinator from the Colts, had some good defenses, but they weren't like league-wide great defenses, certainly weren't like historically great defenses in Indianapolis. Like, this feels like a kind of a strange hire for Chicago. And John Fox, they hired him as a retread, and they brought Mark Trestman over from the CFL, and that lasted, I think, 2 seasons, 1 season before they're like, oh, we got this wrong. And Matt Nagy, who was a name that was floated around as a head coach candidate when the Bears hired him, and he had spent 10 years, I think it was, in Kansas City with Andy Reid, but only one as the offensive coordinator. And there were questions like, well, how much is Matt Nagy actually at the controls, or does he just have the title for that 1 year as offensive coordinator to help sort of elevate him into a head coaching position? And so, there were things to nitpick with each of those hires, especially like the Trestman hire came out of nowhere. The Eberflus one just seemed kind of goofy and kind of off from the get-go. And now they get Ben Johnson. And again, if it doesn't work out, I'm still crediting the Bears for taking the big swing and for getting the prized name that a lot of these teams that have a head coaching vacancy were after and had at the top of their list as well. And so I know Chicago got its guy. They took the big swing. They took the obvious name that everyone had been saying, could have gotten whatever he wanted last year in the coaching cycle, maybe the year before that. And now, third time around, he's finally taken a head coaching job, and it's with Chicago. And so you ask the question, because it does beg of it, what does this mean for the rest of the NFC North? Obviously, you guys and gals know who tune into some of these videos regularly or semi-regularly. This is a Packers-focused channel. So we'll start with Green Bay. What does the Ben Johnson to Chicago Bears move mean for the Green Bay Packers? And Ben Johnson, you start off with the obvious. As the OC of the Detroit Lions the last few years, he's had plenty of success against the Green Bay Packers, whether those were Joe Barry-led defenses or even Jeff Hafley defenses. Although, that first matchup in Lambeau Field this year, I thought Hafley's defense buckled down. Weather played an aspect. Green Bay couldn't necessarily get off the field or get stops when they needed the one big stop. But limited Detroit in some aspects in the first matchup. Second matchup, intercepted Goff in the second half, took a lead briefly in the third quarter, but quite frankly, again, couldn't get a stop when they needed to. Ben Johnson just constantly had Green Bay's defense guessing in both matchups, at least this past season. And so he's had success against the Packers and the defenses. That's not a knock on Jeff Hafley. Green Bay's defense, to me, was pretty damn good this year. Ben Johnson and that Lions offense, just a well-oiled machine. I think from a Packers perspective, if you ask Green Bay fans, they'll say this kind of sucks because you wanted this guy out of the division. Like, part of the, I don't want to say excitement, but part of the reason you're taking a deep breath as a Packers fan, knowing that Ben Johnson is going to be a head coach somewhere, and obviously we now know it's Chicago, but as this year dragged on and it was like, oh, Ben Johnson's the clear-cut top name and he will be taking a job this time around. It'd be crazy if he came back again. He already passed on one cycle, potentially 2 coaching cycles the last 2 off seasons. But part of the enjoyment that you get out of that, if you're a Packers fan, is his Lions offenses have shredded the entire league, including Green Bay. And so you're like, hey, he's gone. He's out of the division. Thankfully, don't have to worry about Ben Johnson. If he goes to the AFC, you worry about him maybe once every 4 years or whatever it is. Instead, he's staying firmly planted, feet in the ground in the NFC North. And so you still have to deal with he and his offenses twice a year. And so you're kind of waffling or debating in your mind, I think, if you're a Packers fan, like, is Ben Johnson being the head coach of the Chicago Bears the lesser of 2 evils when the other option of him being in the division was when he was offensive coordinator of the Lions? What's the worst scenario there for a Packer fan? Ben Johnson stays as the OC of Detroit, or he becomes the head coach of the Bears and tries to figure that out. And so I think that's the kind of what you're leaning on if you're looking for a little bit of optimism, because again, I don't think there's many that can sit back and say, like, on the surface, obviously we won't know until we see tangible results one way or another the next couple of seasons, maybe as early as year 1 for Ben Johnson in Chicago. But I can't imagine there's too many people sitting around like laughing at this hire saying the Bears got it wrong. Like the Eberflus one was mocked, Trussman was mocked, John Fox's a retread was mocked, Nagy, it was, oh, well, he comes from Andy Reid's, coaching tree in Kansas City where they had tons of success. But, I don't think there's a lot of buts with the Ben Johnson hire. He's a first-time head coach. I guess maybe that's what you're hanging on to if you're trying to find holes to poke, I guess, in this hire. But it is him staying in the division is super, super fascinating within all of this. And I know the Bears fan base always gets amped up about the QB they draft every few years and the new head coach they hire every few years, but the Packers-Bears rivalry might just be back on. Like, again, I commend and credit Chicago for doing the obvious, doing everything they had to get Ben Johnson. And I don't want to be saying this. I don't want to be giving credit to the Chicago Bears. But the reality is, if you're the Green Bay Packers, you're looking around. You just won 11 games, and it was only good for 3rd in the division. And the team that finished below you came into your house and won and beat you in Week 18 and just hired Ben Johnson. And so I think this division gets even more difficult to try to navigate. Now, do I expect the Lions to have only 2 losses next season? No, and we'll get to that in a few minutes down the road here in this video. But the Ben Johnson to Chicago shift as the head coach now for the Bears just kind of enhances this division and takes it perhaps to another level. And so if you're a Packers fan, him staying in the division point blank, it's not ideal. And the best hope, I guess, is you cling on to that. Maybe the Bears will be the Bears in some form or fashion, and this won't work out and it'll flop. And Ben Johnson, 4 or 5 years from now, won't be the head coach of the Chicago Bears, because there have been times where I'm trying to think at quarterback or head coach. That's tough to do. There have been times, though, historically, where even when it seems like Chicago may have gotten it right, it just doesn't work out. It's like the Bears are just doomed for failure. And so some franchises, organizations have been like that for a long time. The Bears have been trending towards that direction. And from Minnesota's perspective, too, because I said we're talking about how this affects the rest of the NFC North, pretty much ditto. Like, the same reasons I just laid out for the Packers, like, hey, the Bears-Vikings rivalry might get a little more interesting now. And Vikings fans are probably like, you look at Week 18 and the Lions' defense suffocated the Vikings' offense, but Detroit's offense also did whatever the hell it wanted against Brian Flores' defense. And so I'm sure there were Viking fans thinking similarly to Packer fans, like, hey, thank gosh Ben Johnson's going to be out of the division and gone, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh, he's not the OC of the Lions, but he's the head coach of the Bears. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. Ben Johnson goes to the Bears. What does it mean for all the teams involved in the NFC North? Let's talk about Chicago's perspective, and then we'll get to the real meat and potatoes with Detroit. From Chicago's vantage point, you took the big swing. You got the big name. You didn't think outside the box. You went with what everyone else was saying for once, which was, to me, the correct move. when I zoom out the microscope one level, am I surprised that Ben Johnson took this gig over, let's say, the Raiders and the Jags? Those seem to be the three teams, along with Chicago, obviously. Chicago, Las Vegas, and Jacksonville, that were rumored to be the final three options for Ben Johnson to really choose from. And I mean that quite literally. Like, I think if Ben Johnson wanted the Jacksonville job, they're head over heels about it. They hire Ben Johnson. They don't even think about it. If he wanted the Raiders job, it was reported that he had a Zoom call with Tom Brady, minority owner, for hours last week on Zoom. If Ben Johnson said, hey, I would like to take the Raiders job, the Raiders are like, yes, absolutely. And Chicago, the same thing. And obviously he now is the Bears head coach. Am I surprised he chose Chicago over Las Vegas and Jacksonville? I remember there were multiple reports, and you don't know who's leaking what. Is it Ben Johnson's side? Is it the team side? Like, the Raiders have a head coach and a GM vacancy, and so there were reports floated out a couple weeks ago that Ben Johnson, as he wanted to assemble his staff for wherever he went, he also wanted to be aligned with a general manager. And so, knowing that the Raiders had a head coach and GM vacancy, I thought maybe the Raiders, I don't know how much the Tom Brady, being a minority owner, factored into it. It certainly doesn't hurt the case for Las Vegas, but I thought if he was going to the Raiders, it would be because they had a head coach and a GM opening, and he wanted to align with someone that he knew, like, no matter what, he'd see eye to eye with the general manager. There would be some history, some background there between the two. Now, Jacksonville's an interesting case because their GM is Trent Baalke, I believe, and he's kind of like a little bit in purgatory because Jacksonville's ownership had said, if we have a target for head coach, I'm slightly paraphrasing, but not much. Jacksonville's ownership had said a couple weeks ago, talking to reporters, like, if we have a head coach that we're targeting that would like input on the GM, we'd be open to those discussions, basically saying, like, yeah, our GM can go if we really like that coach. It seemed like he was talking about Ben Johnson. So if Ben Johnson wanted to go to Jacksonville, maybe there's a potential to bring in a new GM too. And the Bears didn't have that because they hung on to Ryan Poles. And so I thought the Raiders' advantage was the GM opening along with the head coach opening. But you look at everything else going on, and the Bears have been a dumpster fire forever. But the one thing the Bears have right now that the Raiders don't is they have their guy at quarterback. And I think when you look at these rosters, like, the Bears far and away have more pieces that you're confident about on both sides of the ball compared to what's going on with the Raiders. Like, the Raiders have Max Crosby, who's a premier edge rusher, but there's been trade rumors, and they hit a home run drafting Brock Bowers, the rookie tight end out of Georgia, but they don't have a quarterback, and I think they have the 6th pick. Like, if you're smitten on Cam Ward or Shadur Sanders, they're both gone, I would assume, by the time the Raiders are up at number 6 in the draft. And so the big looming question mark of quarterback that the Raiders have, that, whether or not you think Caleb Williams will be successful or not, whether or not you think he will be good or not, the Bears have their guy at quarterback that they're rolling with for the foreseeable future. And so that wasn't a question mark that Ben Johnson, or a riddle that he would have to solve. And so he chose that instead of the Raiders. So I'm not surprised he took the Bears job. I'm more fascinated. I think when you dive into this, I'm fascinated by the marriage between Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams is a creator. He's a backyard football type of quarterback. He wants to draw a play up in the mud and then freelance with his buddies and his teammates out on the field, which is fine. It's exhilarating to watch as a consumer of the product. Like, watching those quarterbacks who can extend plays, freelance, go off cue, it's a fun brand to watch. I won't say problem, the issue that could arise is Ben Johnson's scheme is very much so screwed in tightly. It requires discipline from the quarterback. It requires attention to detail from the quarterback. Now, all systems you can say require that. I get it. But the type of quarterback that Ben Johnson has for his scheme when it's succeeding is someone who doesn't really freelance, someone who, oftentimes, if his system's a full goal, plays aren't breaking down where you have to really advance outside the pocket and then, like, start orchestrating things with wide receivers down the field. Sort of that backyard football mentality, or that style. And that's where Caleb Williams is good. Now the offensive line for Chicago was abysmal this past year, and so he took some dumb sacks, but he also made some plays that were like, God dang, like that's impressive. That's what we saw at USC when he did have to extend plays, and that's kind of where he's at its best, where Ben Johnson's scheme doesn't require that. It requires discipline, attention to detail, and sort of being, I don't want to say stubborn with your decision making, but you just need to stick to the plan with Ben Johnson's offense. And they're going to have to hammer that home with Caleb Williams. It's an exciting pairing if you're a Chicago fan, and it may work wonders. But if you pull aside take away the Chicago aspect of this, if you pull aside and look at the type of quarterback that Caleb Williams is when he's at his best and where he excels, and you compare that to how Ben Johnson operates his offense, I don't think it's a seamless fit, but I think Caleb's talented enough and Ben Johnson is this offensive mastermind that it can certainly still work and work well in Chicago. So we'll have to see. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. Chicago hires Ben Johnson. What does it mean for the rest of the NFC North? I'm sure there's many Packer fans, Viking fans who are like, dang, we're not getting rid of this guy, because we saw his offenses in Detroit torture defenses for Minnesota and Green Bay the last couple of years. And I'm trying to think of recent examples where there was an OC or a DC who left that A team and to take a head coaching job in the same division. And I'm sure I'm missing a couple of obvious ones. My brain's kind of just fried at this point, recording this later on Monday night after Ohio State beat Notre Dame in the national championship. So forgive me for not being, as quick as I might usually be. But it definitely adds an angle that Ben Johnson's staying in the division. I know there's a lot of Detroit fans that are pissed off. And the last thing we're going to look at is we're looking at this through the lens of the Detroit Lions losing their offensive coordinator, but losing him to a team in the division. And I know Lions fans don't want to hear this. I know they don't. It is one thing to have to replace Ben Johnson, whose offense the last couple of years, you could make an easy case, was the best in the NFL. If it's not best in the NFL, it's second or third. I mean, at worst, it's a top 3 offense the last couple of seasons. And you can point to, hey, look at all the weapons: Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, that offensive line, Gibbs, Montgomery, Goff. I get all that. They have a lot of weapons. It's still, I was told the Bears had a lot of weapons. I was told Caleb Williams was entering a situation that no other rookie quarterback had entered, and they got Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze and DJ Moore and DeAndre Swift and Cole Kmet, and look at that, it was a dumpster fire. And a lot of that can be pointed at the offensive line. I get it, but I was told Caleb Williams, no rookie quarterback in league history had ever entered a better situation. That was said over and over and over again last offseason after the Bears drafted him. So coaching matters is my point. And so Detroit has all these weapons at the disposal of who's ever at the controls of calling the plays. In this case, it was Ben Johnson the last couple of years. You still have to have a formula as an offensive coordinator to make it work. And that's where the mind of Ben Johnson factors into all of this in a major way. So I'm circling back. I know I'm taking the long route here. I know Lions fans don't want to hear this. To me, it's one thing to have to replace Ben Johnson. It's a whole other issue to have to replace Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. And that's exactly what looks like is going to happen. Hell, when you're watching this video, Aaron Glenn might already have put pen to paper with the Jets or the Saints. It sounds like he's absolutely going to be a head coach. And those were the top 2 names that were floated about for Aaron Glenn. So to me, and he got the most out of a defense that was just battered with injuries this year, and I mean battered. And I know Washington hung up 45. There was a pick 6 in there, and so Detroit's defense gave up 38. But man, he got the week 18. Man, that Vikings offense came rolling into Detroit on an emotional high, and they were tearing through defenses. And would they put up 9 points in a week 18? Winning, you're the 1 seed; losing, you're the 5 seed matchup. And he gave the Packers all it could handle, and then some a couple of weeks before that. Like, Aaron Glenn, damn good coach. And so it'd be one thing for Detroit to have to replace one or the other, Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn. To have to replace both in one off season is brutal. And I don't know how to cushion that blow. Like, It's a big deal if you're Detroit. And you can sit back and you can say, hire from within, hire from within, hire from within. You can say that all you want. It's never going to be exactly the same. Each coach is different. Each coach ticks different and is wired different. If you're the Lions and you're a Lions fan, you trust Dan Campbell to figure it out. Yes, but it's just not a guarantee. Like Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn coming back this past season, it was, even with all the injuries, and there were tons of them, it was a guarantee, like, they're going to have a really good offense and a really good defense. That's why they were favored throughout most of the season to not win the NFC, but to win the freaking Super Bowl before they lost to Washington in the divisional round. Like, it was a certainty that Detroit was going to be a wagon this year because of everything going on with the offense, the defense, and Dan Campbell, the master motivator, but also because Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn came back. And now you're replacing both of those. And you can say hire from within. And, you know, there's guys on the staff who will run things similar to Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. Similar is fine. But this was, it just feels like even with the injuries, Detroit really, really, really missed an opportunity this year. And you lean on Dan Campbell. You trust him to figure it out. Maybe he will. I'm not suggesting the championship window is slammed shut by any sense of the imagination for the Lions. If they win the North next year, though, there'd be a part of me that I won't say would be overly surprised, but more so just like extremely impressed if the Lions run through the gauntlet. And again, they have almost all their main guys. I was looking at their list of free agents for the offseason. They have almost all their main guys under contract back next year, but I'm telling you, having to replace not just any offensive coordinator, having to replace that offensive coordinator, and not just any defensive coordinator, but that defensive coordinator in one off season, it's a lot of are you going to run the same scheme on defense? Is that what's going to be the deciding factor in who you hire for a defensive coordinator? Is bringing in an offensive coordinator relying upon someone who wants to lean on Gibbs and Montgomery still to open up the play action passing, or could you go a different route with an offensive coordinator who wants to get Williams and St. Brown and Laporta involved, maybe more so than Gibbs and Montgomery early on in games? Like, there's a lot of moving pieces on the chessboard right now for Detroit, and I'm just, even if you hire from within, it will be very hard to find two guys who can replicate what Ben Johnson did for that offense the last couple of years and what Aaron Glenn did for that defense. That's my point. And so if Detroit runs through the gauntlet again next year and wins the NFC North, I wouldn't be like, holy crap, this is stunning, but I would be extremely, extremely impressed if that happened. And keep this in mind, too. This is down the road talk for later in the offseason. Just close your eyes for a second and listen to this list. Close your eyes and listen to these teams. This is the road schedule for the Detroit Lions next season. Their road schedule. They have 8 at home, 9 on the road. Obviously, they play at the Packers, at the Lions, at the Bears within the division. The other 6 road games for Detroit next year: at the Eagles, at the Commanders. Oh, those are the 2 last teams standing in the NFC. One of those teams is going to the Super Bowl this year. They play at the Eagles, at the Commanders, at the Chiefs. Oh, going for a three-peat this year. They're in the AFC Championship. At the Ravens. Oh, Lamar might win his 3rd MVP. At the Bengals. Oh, Burrow's been to a Super Bowl, and they're going to be chomping at the bit after missing the playoffs this year. And at the Rams. Again, the road slate for Detroit next year: at Packers, at Lions, at Bears in the division, and then at Eagles, at Commanders, at Chiefs, at Ravens, at Bengals, at Rams. That is murderer's row for a road schedule. Change can be a good thing in a lot of cases. You want to advocate for change sometimes, right? To keep the mind evolving, keep it fresh, things of that nature. In this case, with Detroit, you would have loved to have clung on to what you had if you're the Lions. And you knew it wasn't going to happen. Like, Ben Johnson was as good as gone. This was his last year. Aaron Glenn, a little more. Maybe he's back, maybe he's not. Now it seems like he's gone. Like, now it would be very shocking if he's back in Detroit, just based off all the reports. I know a lot of Lions fans are upset about the timing with the interviews and then the loss to Washington and the reports that Cliff Kingsbury, the OC for Washington, said he's not going to do any interviews until after their season's over. And then Ben Johnson, 2 days after the season ends, all of a sudden, boom, he's the head coach of the Bears, and boom, he has Dennis Allen as his defensive coordinator, and boom, he's got the Saints interim coach, I forget his name, lined up as potentially a special teams coordinator in Chicago, and you're like, this had to have been in the works for a while. This doesn't all come together in a couple of hours. And so you're wondering, I know it's unfair to say it, but a lot of Lions fans are like, Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, how much was the focus on the playoff run instead of where they're going to be the head coach at next? And it's a rule I would like to see changed in the NFL. I just don't know how realistic that is. Like, interviews and job openings can't be filled, requested for interviews, none of that until after the Super Bowl. It makes all the sense in the world, but I feel like people have brought it up many times in the past, and it just has never come to fruition. So, yeah, Ben Johnson staying in the division. If you're a Packers fan, a Vikings fan, you're like, dang, we can't get rid of the guy. And then you look over and you're like, well, the Lions still have all their pieces in place for next year, and the Bears should now obviously be better, one would imagine. And yeah, it's gonna be a dogfight in the NFC North, that's for sure. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Always appreciate all the support. We'll see you next time.